The last several seasons have been complete chaos for the Big 12. Tons of realignment, schools shuffling in and out of this conference. You've got schools in Florida and Texas and Utah and Arizona all in the Big 12. And the Big 12 has been an agent of chaos because of it, and the skill gap between the bottom and top teams is very small, and for that reason you see a lot of crazy results in this conference, and it's resulted in some bad blood that's still developing, but also there's some deep-seated rivalries that have existed for a long time. So in today's video we're going to take a look at all of those Big 12 rivalries and put them on a tier list using the same scale we've used in the last couple of videos, starting at the top with fever pitch, going to boiling point, heated rivalries, needs a spark, and then on simmer at the bottom. I went ahead and inverted the colors of the tier list for this video because some people were mentioning it doesn't make sense that it gets red as it goes down, but the temperature decreases or whatever, so I flipped it to where it makes a little bit more sense. We'll start at the bottom tier, which is on simmer. A couple of rivalry games in here, one of them which was technically imported into this conference, and the other one is Kansas versus Oklahoma State, some legacy Big 12 teams here. This is a game that makes sense. There's been a lot of time for them to establish this, but Oklahoma State has just kind of dominated it. It's been very one-sided. Kansas has very few big moments, very few wins in this rivalry game, and for that reason, not many people know or talk about it, and Kansas just hasn't been relevant in that game. And then there's Cincinnati versus West Virginia, which makes sense geographically, just has not had enough time to mature and grow, and I think many people would not list this rivalry game very high on their list. It's an old Big East matchup though, which is something that I definitely like. So we'll take things up a notch and go to the needs a spark tier, where you're going to see some games that you probably recognize a little easier here. Houston versus Baylor and Houston versus Texas Tech are a couple of in-state rivalries in the state of Texas, which I always think turns things up a notch. The issue here has been the fact that Houston hasn't had necessarily the time to play these guys on an annual basis to really build that up, and they're going to get that chance in the Big 12. So a chance for little brother Houston, who's usually been a Group of 5 program, to get even with Baylor and Texas Tech and play those guys a little bit more often. Kansas versus Kansas State is no doubt a rivalry. The teams do not like each other. They play each other every single season, but Kansas State has been dominating this. They've won a lot of games in a row in this series. So Kansas, just like with the Oklahoma State game, they've got to win one. They need a spark here to ignite that rivalry a little bit. Colorado versus Utah has a kind of cool rivalry name, the Rumble and the Rockies, but it always felt forced in the Pac-12. Does not feel like these two fan bases really care about each other or hate each other even, which is what you look for in a rivalry game, and there hasn't been a ton of back and forth. Utah pretty much dominated when it was in the Pac-12. Maybe something happens and catalyzes in the Big 12, but you just get a feeling Utah's more concerned about teams like BYU and even Utah State, and Colorado is more concerned about like Colorado State or maybe Kansas State, which we'll talk about that one later in this list. But then you've got Cincinnati versus UCF, another one that's kind of imported from the American Conference. They just had some high-stakes games in that conference, but when you think about it, Central Florida, Cincinnati, geographically doesn't make a ton of sense, and so for that reason, it's in the needs a spark tier. The next tier is going to be the heated rivalries in the Big 12. We've got a trifecta in this tier, 3 games, which starts with Kansas State versus Colorado, which is a little bit of a hot take, but just hear me out. I really love the vibes in this game when these guys played this last season, and it's a historical rivalry and one that I think could really easily get back on its feet. They had a really good game this last year. Avery Johnson's hitting the Coach Prime dance in the end zone. There was just a lot of fun back and forth. I had a great time watching this game, so there might be some personal bias baked in, but I really feel like this is one that is primed to be a great rivalry, and pun is intended on that one. And then you've got Baylor versus Oklahoma State on here. Not a ton of history, but it makes sense, and the recent history has been really strong. They had that Big 12 title game rematch. They've had a lot of really fun matchups in the regular season and some seasons where both teams have had great years and have sort of countered each other. So it's resulted in some solid matchups, and I think it's an underrated rivalry. And then there's TCU versus Texas Tech, another in-state one in Texas. Some high-stakes battles. They played a decent amount in the Big 12, and so there's definitely some bad blood there. Really solid, heated rivalry. Getting into the next tier, we've got boiling point. These rivalry games have hit a boiling point, and we start with Baylor versus Texas Tech, another classic in-state Big 12 rivalry. That's really great. It's got a great name, the Butt Rivalry, or the Butt Bowl as some people call it, and it's just a great vibe. I love seeing these teams clash, and I think they're teams that are just in a similar tier in the state of Texas. Yes, Texas Tech fans might hate Texas more than Baylor. And yes, Baylor fans might hate also Texas more than Texas Tech, but this is a great middle ground for a couple of programs that are on a similar tier to measure up versus each other each season. It's always felt like a little bit more of a natural fit, and I honestly think these two teams should just embrace being some of each other's main rivals. But there is Baylor versus TCU, which is another phenomenal rivalry. I think extremely underrated. These two, I think, should be each other's main rival, and they've embraced it. They've called it the Blue Bonnet Battle, which I'm not sure how I feel about that name still, but they've had some fantastic classic games. I think back to that crazy Trevon Boykin versus Bryce Petty duel where TCU choked like a 21-point lead. The ending score was like 60-58 or something crazy like that. These are the types of games that get me fired up, and there's nothing that screams Big 12 more than Baylor versus TCU. It's just a pure Big 12 matchup. And then, of course, we have Farmageddon, Iowa State versus Kansas State. The Big 12 really kills it with some of these rivalry nicknames, and the vibes are always great when these two match up. The fact that they're playing in Dublin this year, I'm a little unsure of. I think that's going to affect the rivalry juice of this game a little bit, but I love whenever these guys clash, and I think it's always one of the top tier Big 12 rivalries. I think it's been ignited a little bit as of recent memory. Iowa State had a little bit there where they were sort of dragging their feet here, but outside of that, it's great rivalry. I think it's reached a boiling point. Both teams are contenders. These are two of the favorites to win the Big 12 this year, and so when they clash, it's going to be really intense. Finally, we have reached the top tier, which is going to be fever pitch. You've got two matchups here, and ironically, these are two imported rivalries from the Pac-12. One of them, I guess, only half from the Pac-12, but still, two rivalry games that are imported into this conference. Arizona State versus Arizona in the Territorial Cup. Just two teams that really despise each other, and programs on a very similar tier, on a very similar level. They play each other every year at the end of the year, and you just get the sense, whatever the external circumstances are, it does not matter what the two teams' records are. If you can beat the other guy and get the Territorial Cup, it'll make your whole season. And it's just a really pure thing that happens in a rivalry game when there's no one else to be your rival, so you just have to embrace the other team. Like Arizona and Arizona State are the only two FBS teams in the state of Arizona, so it just makes sense. BYU versus Utah, this is just fever pitch at its finest. The teams take a little bit of a hiatus where they don't play each other. It gives it more time to brew in the hatred, and now they get a matchup against each other. It's called the Holy War, and even though that name is really intense, it almost feels like it doesn't do it justice because it's such a great game whenever these guys match up. It just feels like everything is on the line. The urgency is there. And I don't know why they don't have this game at the end of the year on the schedule. It's got to be something to do with the BYU and Utah administration being stubborn or something like that. But it's another phenomenal rivalry game that is always a pleasant game. And it really feels like the heat has been turned up in this one recently with them taking that small break, not playing each other, and just some of the crazy close finishes they've had over the last couple of seasons. So that does it for the Big 12 rivalry tier list. We did all of the Big 12 rivalries that exist there, which I admit it's a little sparse compared to what it used to be. They got rid of some of their iconic rivalries, but I think more are going to continue to bud and develop in this conference. So let me know down in the comments, what are some other rivalry games that you think could emerge from this conference that maybe weren't on this list, or maybe some games you already consider to be a rivalry that weren't on this list. Let me know all that stuff down in the comments, and that's all I got for you guys in this video. I will see you guys later this week.